Okay, good Erev Shabbos. Um, so Rav Shlomo Yosef Zevin records the following story about the Baal Shem Tov, who's also known as the Besht for short, Besht, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Besht, Baal Shem Tov and his students, were once staying at an inn, a small hotel, while traveling between towns. The Baal Shem Tov was known to travel a lot. And that inn, the night that they were staying there, was also hosting a joyous wedding between two young people, young man and young woman. Next morning, the Besht and his companions saw that the man and woman were standing there waiting for a carriage to take them home from the inn to their hometown. And the Besht saw that there was a bird, in the tree above them, chirping. And the Baal Shem Tov turned to his students, and he said that the bird was talking about the couple, and the bird was reciting a verse that we're going to read from the Torah tomorrow in Parshat Pinchas. La'ela techalek aretz, for these shall the land be divided. That's the simple translation. And at the time of this story, when they were hearing this from the Baal Shem Tov, this biblical citation seemed very strange to the students. The land will be divided for these, we mean the man and the woman. What does that mean? How is it the land divided for them? Many years later, after the couple had already raised a family and their children had left home and had gotten married themselves and had their own children, the husband, in his later years, told his wife that he wanted to make Aliyah to live his last years in the land of Israel. Unfortunately, the man's wife was not so enthusiastic about this idea of moving far away from their children and grandchildren and the life that they knew there in probably Russia. And so that it got so contentious that the couple had to approach the Beis Din, the rabbinical court, to decide between them. And the Gemara at the end of Masachet Ketubot records that a man or woman actually halachically, according to the Gemara, can force their spouse to move to Israel and cannot force them to leave Israel. But most Mefarshim, most poskim, most of the halachic authorities, at least in the pre-State of Israel era, ruled that this is not in practice, that in practicality, if a man or a woman wants to move to Israel, they cannot force their spouse to go with them. And so ultimately it was decided by the court that neither spouse could force the other to stay in Europe or to move to Israel. They couldn't force each other to do what the other one couldn't force each other to do what they wanted. And so as a result of this court ruling, the couple who had been together for all these years since that joyous wedding day that the Besht was present for, this couple finally had to separate, and they got divorced, and they divided up their belongings and moved to different homes. The husband moving to Israel, the wife staying with her family in Europe. And it was only then that when the students heard about their divorce, that the Baal Shem Tov students understood what the Besht had meant when he said about the couple that la'ela techalek haaretz. That it means not that the bride and groom would divide the land, but rather la'ela techalek haaretz, that the land of Israel, will ultimately divide them, divide this couple. Indeed, la'ela techalek haaretz, the land dividing between people, is true not only for that specific individual couple, but for the Jewish people more broadly. As much as our homeland in Eretz Yisrael has been at times a source of geographic, political, and religious unity for Jews, it has also been a great source of division between us. And one great example of that tendency appears in Parshat Pinchas in the context of the daughters of Tzlachad. Because when the Torah introduces these 5 sisters, it does not only tell us who their father was, Tzlachad, or who their grandfather was, Not only that they're from the tribe of Menashe, but the Torah for some reason adds on, oh yeah, by the way, Menashe was also the son of Yosef. And the Midrash points out that this is unnecessary. Of course, by now, by the time you get to that pasuk in the Torah, we're very aware that Menashe is one of Yosef's sons. And so the Midrash explains that the Torah is intentionally connecting these women, the Benot Tzlavcha, to their ancestor Joseph, to teach us something about the character of both of them. At the end of Sefer Breshit, during the story of the sale of Joseph and his eventual rise to power in Egypt, Yosef repeatedly displays a deep love of the land of Israel. He identifies himself as an Ivri to the Egyptians, as being a foreigner from the other side of the Nile, as being a Jew from the land of Canaan of Israel, which the Midrash points out is in contrast to Moshe Rabbeinu. And moreover, despite the fact that Yosef was the viceroy of Egypt, and it would be very insulting to Paro to make this request, Yosef makes his brothers swear that they will ensure that Yosef is ultimately buried in the land of Israel. The Midrash asserts that the Torah is trying to communicate to us that just like their ancestor Yosef, the daughters of Tzlavchad, Benot Tzlavchad, are asking for a portion in the land of Israel because of their chibat haaretz, their deep love of the land of Eretz, the land of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel specifically. And the Imre Emet, the fourth Ger Rebbe, was asked the following obvious question about this Rashi, about this Midrash, by his mother. She noted that the daughters of Tzlavcha do not explicitly mention anything about Eretz Israel being special. They only asked to receive an inheritance in place of their father. And so said the mother of the Imre Emes, who is also, I don't know her name, but she was also married to the Sfas Emes. She asked her son, well, maybe Benot Tzlavcha shouldn't get so much credit. Maybe they were only doing it because they wanted money. They wanted the wealth and status that comes with owning land. Maybe they weren't doing it because of any personal connection to the land of Israel. Maybe they were doing it just because of their father's name. Who says that they loved specifically Eretz Israel? So to that, the Imre Emes, Rav Avram Mordechai Alter, he answered to his mother that really, according to the Gemara, if you look at the Gemara on Shabbos, the daughters of Tzlavchad, their father died 38 years earlier. He didn't just die now in Parshat Pinchas, he died much earlier. And if what the daughters of Tzlavchad wanted was money and status, then they should have complained about getting the inheritance of their father much earlier, when he first died. The fact that they only approached Moshe as they stood on the banks of the Jordan River, on the cusp of entering the land of Israel, that proves their interest in inheritance was based on a love of Eretz Israel, and not on greed or on desire for status. And Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, in his commentary on Dvar, he adds that the daughters specifically say that they want to inherit B'toch Achei Avinu, together with their paternal uncles, who were among those members of the tribe of Menashe who inherited land on the western side of the Jordan River in Israel proper, and not on the east bank of the Jordan River, further supporting their love of the promised land, in particular the land that was promised to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, which was on the west bank of the Jordan River. But the Midrash in Yalkut Shimoni and Midrash Tanchuma actually expands well beyond just the daughters of Tzlavchad themselves. The Midrash says that not only did they love the land of Israel, but, says the Midrash, all Jewish women of their generation had that quality, had that chibat haaretz. The Midrash informs us that not only the Midrash informs us that only the Jewish men had sinned with the golden calf, with the KTM. Only the men had believed the spies, done the Chet HaMiraglim. Only the men had expressed any doubt ever about entering Israel and a desire to return to Egypt. But the women did not do that. The women always loved the land of Israel. Kli Yakar further adds that the reason the sin of the spies occurred was because Moshe sent 12 men to survey the land of Canaan and its inhabitants. Women, however, were always committed to entering Eretz Israel. Their faith never wavered, even with all the difficulties they knew were ahead, and even though they knew that they themselves, and only the men, they would not be receiving their own separate portions in the land of Israel, only men would be getting land. The women would never have given a negative report, says the Kli Yakar, and they would have convinced the people to continue their march toward the promised land. In other words, la'ela techalei ka'aretz, love of the land of Israel not only sometimes separates one husband and wife, but it has been in our history a source of tension and division between all Jewish men and all Jewish women, or between large segments of the Jewish people. In fact, the Midrash says that it was for this reason that Benot Tzlavcha did not marry for all those years until they approached Moshe about receiving their father's portion in the land, because they could only marry people who shared their values, who shared that chibat ha'aretz. And the Jewish people today are increasingly divided around that same issue, although the different factions are not neatly organized around gender. There is a growing camp of Jews, particularly in the American Jewish community, that rejects the very idea of a uniquely Jewish homeland, of a state with a Jewish culture and identity. Young Jews increasingly question the very concept of Zionism, of the desire for a national Jewish return to the land of Israel and a Jewish homeland. This past week, Peter Beinart, a well-known journalist who writes for The Atlantic, published a manifesto in the Jewish Currents magazine in which he formally rejects the Zionist dream of a Jewish state. Instead, he adopts the concept of one state shared equally between Jews and Palestinians. He says such a solution provides for the Jewish need for a homeland without a specifically Jewish state. And in response, Yehuda Kurtzer wrote an article in Tablet in which he explains the problems with Beinart's approach. And ultimately, says Kurtzer, the approach newly embraced by Beinart is a reflection of diasporism, of a reluctance and a fear among some Jews to do the almost impossibly difficult work of leaving the diaspora once and for all and achieving self-determination in our own land. Building a Jewish state, just like any other state, is difficult and riddled with ethical dilemmas, with economic, security, and diplomatic challenges. And it's particularly difficult in the context of a Jewish people that wants to be moral, ethical, wants to follow the values of the Torah, as well as its halachot, wants to be part of that, the dream and the promise of our own homeland, of our own state, with at the same time acknowledging that we need to be good people. And inevitably, we will go, as the state of Israel continues to exist, we'll go through mistake after mistake, disappointment after disappointment, periods of progress and periods of regression. That's going to happen. But to abandon the Zionist project altogether, to accept that Jews cannot govern themselves and maintain their own state with its own culture and identity in a moral way, is to resign ourselves to permanent diaspora. To do so is to look at Israel's founding as a disaster, as a churban, rather than the beginning of an uphill battle for self-determination and Jewish independence. We cannot be like the Beinarts of the world, who call for us to abandon ship and return to Egypt, to stay permanently in exile, to continue to wander in the wilderness. Many of us may be disappointed or even angry at various decisions made by the state of Israel and frustrated by the corruption that we see in its leadership and in its bureaucracy. But we must be like the Jewish women of the Dvar HaMidbar, the women exemplified by the Dvar Tzavcha, who loved the land of Israel and were not afraid to face its many challenges. Let us model ourselves on Joseph and on his descendants, on Machla, Noah, Chagla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Let us be willing to find a way to share the land with all of its inhabitants, rather than let the land divide us or be separated from us and removed of its Jewish character. And may we all be gathered together back to the Jewish homeland speedily and safely, back to our unique place on earth, which God has promised to our ancestors to ultimately give to us. I want to wish you a safe and a good Shabbos and a good week next week. Shabbos.